let me introduce, if you haven't met him before, Dr Ben Wellings. Ben's a lecturer in European Studies at Monash, has been a visiting and is a visiting research fellow at Huddersfield University. He has been a lecturer at ANU, author of English Nationalism and Euroscepticism, Losing the Peace. And you can read more. No, not you. They can read more about you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me up the back here, or is that all right? Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you. I'm one of those people who likes to pace around a bit when they teach and talk. So I'm sort of in a more natural environment. But I do want to refer to some statistics as I go, not many, just to give a little bit of precision about what I'm going to say. So what I'm talking about in the next 20 minutes, and Peter, your talk really gave wonderful context to this, is the relationship between England, Britain and Europe, right? In the whole context of Euroscepticism, okay? So what I've found when I've been teaching about the European Union in Australian universities over the last 10 years is that you can't beat a good crisis to help teach, right? I started teaching this in 2004, and teaching European history is fine because there's a lot of wars. Right? And then the students seem to kind of like that. Right? Teaching European politics initially was harder because it was all about consensus and getting on. Right? And there's not so much to get your teeth into in that sense in terms of delivering some sort of problem that students feel that they can resolve. Now I know my students are going to be typically older than yours, and at the ANU, and as far as I can tell at Monash, they're quite high socioeconomic group. A lot of my students have been to Europe fairly recently on a gap year. You know, many would have been from, say, Anglo-Celtic families, so on and so forth. So it was always kind of easy to teach something when there was a problem for them to solve. And then thankfully the French and the Dutch rejected the draft constitution in 2005, which made my job a lot easier. It made things harder in Brussels and in the chancelleries of Europe. I appreciate that, but from my point of view, it's quite handy. Right? It meant that there was some point of contention that was live and not just happening in the past, that I was able to hook debates about European integration onto, so that it, not that it felt like a long way away, because actually the students seemed to appreciate the kind of exoticism of what was going on. As far as they were concerned, you couldn't find anywhere more dull than Australia, and so all their sort of interest was focused outwards. So that bit was okay. It wasn't the distance that was the problem. It was more the lack of any kind of difficulty or contentiousness in which to focus a debate. So then, from my point of view, things just got better, really, right? So then the Irish rejected another European treaty, not once but twice, and then we had the financial crisis. And what this meant is that you're able to construct courses around these sort of debates that were very much focused on problem solving. And this meant that you can simulate all sorts of things and teach European institutions through simulating votes in various different, you know, like the European Council or the European Parliament, or the other one that I did, which is have a referendum on whether the UK should remain part of the EU, right? So then, in January last year, it just got even better when David Cameron announced that there was going to be a referendum on whether Britain would stay in the EU if the Conservative Party won a majority in 2015 at their elections. And so this was all just, you know, heading in my direction really now, because it seemed like the classroom activities was aligned with what was happening outside, right? It also happens that that was one of my research interests, and so in terms of a kind of a crisis, EU-UK relations are really the gift that keeps on giving. You know, you can't, depending on which decade you're interested in, you can do this historically, you can do it contemporaneously, and as Bruno mentioned, you've got sort of towering sort of figures like Margaret Thatcher, which I know it's difficult to convey sometimes historical figures to people whose historical memory may not go back 5 years, and I don't, you know. So if I'm teaching 20-year-olds, I don't assume that they have really heard of, you know, Winston Churchill or any, you know, like anyone like that. But Margaret Thatcher cuts through. You know, she's got a bit of whatever it takes to cut through. She always had. And anyway, so she's one of those figures that you can really, you know, focused teaching around. Second thing to say is that I agree with Bruno earlier on when he was saying, well, European integration proceeds as a response to crises, right? And I would say yes, but as Peter was saying, there's integration and there's integration. So, for example, what I think is happening is that there is more integration for a smaller group of countries. And the best example of that really is the Eurozone, right? So there's a single currency, but it's not a common currency, right? So what you've got here is what some people call a two-speed Europe, right? This is one of the ways that people who analyse European integration talk about these things. We have, you know, variable geometry, two-speed Europe. My favourite is core and non-core Europe. That sort of echoes one of those election promises of John Howard some years ago, doesn't it? But you know, there's all these sort of ways of thinking about the European Union that is not so much, you know, we have to jettison thinking about it as a sort of a federation in the making, although there are, you know, a small group of people within Europe who would like it to be that. And perhaps the better analogy is a kind of medieval Carolingian Holy Roman Empire type thing with shared sovereignty, devolved sovereignty, different elements of power and obligation in different parts. So I think that what I want to talk about when I'm talking about UK-EU relationships is what I'm calling the wild card of the crisis. Right? So the main crisis is clearly the financial one, the Eurozone crisis. And yes, indeed, we may be seeing a kind of a turning point if you look at Ireland, for example, or even the way the ambassador was talking about Greece. You know, we may see the end of the sort of the financial dimensions to these crises, but certainly the social dimensions are ongoing. Right? And how those will play out politically, I don't really know. The other thing that I want to say is that we use this term crisis quite often. You hear it a lot in relationship to the European Union, but I want to make a qualification. I think that crisis is not quite the right word for two reasons, and certainly in relation to UK-EU relations. The first is that the EU, and like other polities, like other member states in the EU and like other countries that are not part of the EU, is suffering sort of a multiple political crises, of which the Eurozone is only the most evident one. Another underlying crisis goes back, I think, to those rejections of European treaties in 2009, 8 and 5. And there's also, I think your slide mentioned this, Peter, there's this kind of this populist response, which goes back to our question earlier on, whereby a widening gulf has emerged between, you know, what you might call governing elites and populaces. Now, of course, not everyone subscribes to this, but one Dutch author has described the last 20 years or so as we're living in a populist zeitgeist, you know, populist times, where it's very easy, because as political decision-making becomes more complicated, it's very easy to sort of say, well, here's a kind of a corrupt elite that is robbing you of, you know, your freedoms or your material prosperity and so on and so forth. And Hansonism is the best example of that here in Australia. And a lot of anti-European political parties, like the United Kingdom Independence Party, often describe as, you know, Hansonism in Britain, but with removal, you know, withdrawal from the EU as their central plank. Right? So it's that kind of populist zeitgeist, if you like, that's driving a lot of these this crisis. Another reason that crisis isn't quite the right word is that a crisis in medical parlance refers to the moment when the fever breaks. Right? So it's very difficult to have a notion then of an ongoing crisis. We often hear of this notion of an ongoing crisis, but I think that's an oxymoron. And I think that what we're really talking about, particularly when we talk about EU-UK relations, is more like a chronic condition. Right? It's more like an allergy that you've got, or that sort of annoying rash that you can't get rid of, or whatever. UK-EU relations have always been slightly different. This goes back to debates about UK accession in the 1970s, and this is where the whole idea of whether the United Kingdom should kind of pursue a Commonwealth-oriented policy, an Atlantic-oriented policy, or a European policy. Could it do all three? Well, the governments of the day decided it could only really do two out of those three, and that was the Atlantic and the European. So, ever since that time, it's not been a smooth relationship, I think we can say. And then we sort of get, if you like, the kind of the response to that privileges party politics, and it would say, well, you know, Margaret Thatcher was particularly argumentative or strong-minded, or Tony Blair thought he could sort of be European, but actually when the Iraq War came around, he sort of showed his true colours. Well, there's elements of truth in that, of course, but I don't think it tells the full picture. And that's why I've given, on your USB drives, I've attached the findings of a survey that was carried out. It's the second of two surveys, actually, that is trying to sort of unpack this notion of what might be driving Euroscepticism within the United Kingdom. And it's an answer that I think is surprising, but actually worth making. And if you look in those surveys carried out by the Institute of Public Policy Research in London and the universities of Cardiff and Edinburgh, the first point to make is that they find that the British are not Eurosceptic. That the British are not Eurosceptic. But this isn't the glad tidings that it might perhaps at first seem, and that is because there aren't many British people in Britain anymore. So what it thank you, yes. So what it, for example, I'll put some, here we are. What they do is to try, when they split down, you know, what kind of national identifications people have in the United Kingdom, because of course there are lots of different peoples. There are English people, there are Welsh people, there are Scots, and then Ireland is of course a different category. There are kind of Ulster Protestants, there are Catholic nationalists, and then there are Cornish, Manx, so on and so forth, right? They ask these questions in surveys, and they've been doing this about 20 years now. You know, do you see yourself as English, not British, more English than British, equally English than British, you know, so on and so forth. And then you can multiply that by doing that for the Scots, the Welsh, and anyone that you want to ask a question about. So what they found out is that, in fact, there aren't many British people anymore. Okay, so self-identification, and I'm gonna just triangulate this with another survey from 2011. The UK Census, which is carried out every 10 years, not every 5 years in the UK, for the first year in 2011, they actually asked a question about English nationality. Now, in 2001, in response to a kind of a surge in Scottish and Welsh nationalism, there was a question about, you know, being Welsh. And then various people in clubs and pubs in Britain kind of harumphed about this and sort of said, well, how come, you know, you get to ask these questions about whether you're Welsh or, you know, whether you're from a Pakistani background or from an Indian background, but there's no question about English. So the Office of National Statistics relented, and they said that for the first time in 2011, it said, due to an increased interest in national consciousness and a demand for people to acknowledge their national identity, question about English identity was included in the census. And what they found was that white people were the largest ethnic group at 86%. So I should go back. There's 62 million people that live in the United Kingdom. So that's your base number. But the census is only for England and Wales. Right? Scotland does its own survey, the results of which are coming out soon. Census, sorry. So white people are the largest ethnic group at 86%, and white British at 80%. So that 6% is explained by Australians and white Americans, and, you know, so on and so forth. Right? What was surprising that they asked this question was that people who said that they were English alone, they weren't even English and British, was 59%. So well over half of people in, and that includes England and Wales as well, so it'd be a little bit more actually, if you think about it. Well over half of the population of England now considers itself only English. When you add those people who thought they were English more than British, it comes up to 70%. Right? When you look at it even further and you say, well, who then feels that they're British? It's only 19%. Break that down even further, and what happens is that most British people live in London, and most British people are black or other mixed ethnicities. Right? So Enoch Powell will be turning in his grave at this particular moment. Right? So what it means is that being British is now a minority identity in two senses in England. It's a minority in the sense that minorities typically identify with it, and it's a minority because so few people identify with it. Right? Disproportionately represented in London, as I said. Then, when you get back to this thing about, well, and I'm switching back here to the IPPR research now, is, well, when you start to look at what nationality feels most Eurosceptical or Europhilic, those people who thought that the EU was a good thing, if you identified as British, it was at 45%. If you identified as English, it was at 14%. So the more English you are, the more Eurosceptic you tend to be, is the conclusion we might draw from that. And I think that the reason that this is important, and the reason I've labelled that one, is because I think that that starts to explain something about Euroscepticism emanating from the United Kingdom. Right? What I want to argue is that despite the persistent narrative of difference between the UK and the EU, they share one important attribute in common. They're both multinational political unions needing to manage centripetal forces that threaten to pull those unions apart. Okay, we'll know that Scotland has a referendum on independence in September this year. Right? And we've seen some of the tensions that the Euro crisis has placed on the European Union. And that's important because the fact that the United Kingdom itself is seeking to prevent the breakup of its own and very old political union is not unrelated to the fact that the United Kingdom taken as a whole is the one place calls for breakup of the EU have to be taken seriously. So you'll see that the Greek ambassador was really at pains to say, well, even in Greece, people don't really want to come out of the EU or even the Eurozone. That doesn't seem to be a political option at the moment. So it's unusual in a sense, when we think about the causality of this, that the United Kingdom, that has been so opposed over successive governments to being part of the single currency, is the place where calls for exit from the EU are most advanced. And that's where, if you're thinking of hooking a lesson or something around an event, the European elections in May might be quite interesting, because it's here that we're expecting the United Kingdom Independence Party, that Hansonism in Britain, to do quite well at the European elections. Now, UKIP, to give its short name, was started in 1993. It was founded by a professor of history at the London School of Economics, and it was originally designed to push the British government to give a referendum on whether Britain should remain in the EU or not. And from those small origins, it grew until about, in the late 1999, it was kind of still a little bit on the fringes, but it had won a couple of seats in the European Parliament. It's not many, there's roughly 680 odd seats in the European Parliament at the moment. I think that's 736 now. Anyway, it's going up. Anyway, at the time there were not many, so 2 seats is not a big deal. But when you look at it in the UK example, the number of seats start to go up. So first of all, in 2004 it wins 12 seats. Then it consolidates that position in 2009 and wins 13 seats. This is out of 78, sorry. Out of 78 seats. And then we're expecting it in May this year to do quite well. Now, we don't know whether it's going to push the Conservatives into second or third place, or whether it will come first itself. We don't yet know. But there's a considerable degree of political interest, if you like, around this question at the moment. And the thing about the United Kingdom Independence Party is that its name belies its origins. Right? It claims to be UK-wide, but in fact it's English, really. When you look at the distribution of its votes, where its MEPs come from, they basically come, there's one from Wales, the rest are from England and none in London. Right? So again, London is sort of unusual in this particular regard. And what I think we can take UKIP as is sort of an expression of an English nationalism which otherwise doesn't really know how to express itself. Right? One of the findings that you'll find in this IPVR report is that English nationalism has become politicised. You know, it's not just a cultural matter anymore. It's typically kind of put in jokey terms about Morris dancing, or drinking real ale, or like those kind of cultural attributes. What we're finding is that people who self-identify as being English are least satisfied with the political status quo, and this is partly driven by devolution to Scotland. It's partly driven, and I think more so, driven by resistance to European integration. I tend to the view that most people in England don't know where Scotland is. That in fact, they're much more driven by their understanding of Scottish politics is typically low, whereas Europe looms large in the English imagination. Again, some of those survey results suggest that people in England think that the EU has much more power and influence. Well, I was going to say than it does. They might be right, but they think that it has much more power and influence than other people in other parts of the United Kingdom and Europe. Right, so it looms large in their imagination. Okay, so and this is where Simon's notion of straight bananas and so on. There's all these kind of things that come up in the British press, which paint a particular picture of the European Union and its raison d'etre. But I think that it's interesting to take, I've been tracking this for about 10 years now, and 10 years ago, the way of understanding English nationalism was that there was an expectation of an English backlash against the Scots and the Welsh and so on, but that never really happened. And I think that this was partly because the English 10 years ago didn't have a way of imagining themselves as a political community. Now, I'll give you an example of this. In 2006, there was a poll taken by the Telegraph, the centre-right newspaper in London. And in it, more English people wanted Scotland to become independent than Scottish people. So the way that I read that is that here's a group of nationalists, or people with a sort of a kind of an emergent nationalist feeling, who couldn't really think of like, what's England supposed to do? Declare itself independent from Wales? It sort of doesn't make sense politically. So you have to kind of imagine that, or wish it onto someone else. So I think that this is perhaps changing a little bit now. But what I think we've got is, if you like, this is probably the point where I'll conclude, is Euroscepticism functions, in my view, as a kind of a surrogate English nationalism. Right? It's not simply a matter of people disagreeing with the speed or the pace of European integration in one direction or another, although of course that comes into it. It's actually a product of something much more unhappy within the body politic of the United Kingdom, and that is, it's a product of English nationalism. It's an English nationalism which can not only doesn't have, but can have no kind of political content which you might recognise as nationalist in another form, right? Like secession, for example. It can't be the same as Scottish nationalism because the situations of the countries are different. Where it can start to look a bit more like a Scottish nationalism, and I think this is where the flight of politicised English people tends towards Euroscepticism, is in relation to the European Union. And that's where it starts to look more like a kind of secessionist nationalism. There are all these calls for withdrawal or referendums, which are kind of a masked call for withdrawal from the European Union. I've been maintaining for some time, when people ask me, well, do you think that people would vote to leave, for Britain to leave the European Union? I said, well, sometimes people just are grumpy in polls, aren't they? They just, they just take the chance, they vent a bit, and they're perhaps a bit more extreme than they would be. And in fact, the European elections kind of function in a way as a big poll like that. They're kind of mid-term for many governments, and they're just a way of beating them up. And I've always said, well, look, when it comes to an actual vote, if you actually said to people, do you really want to leave? I thought the vote would narrow quite, it would be narrowly in favour of Britain staying in, which would resolve nothing, right? Because the Eurosceptics would just feel aggrieved, and the majority would not be all that emphatic. But I'm kind of beginning to lose faith in that argument a bit. I'm actually wondering if the consistent polling results do seem to show a level of hostility towards European integration, which is quite different. I'll end on this, right? So, the Future of England survey, that's the IPPR stuff, found that first of all that 43% of those surveyed thought that UK membership of the EU was a bad thing. That's way in advance of any other part of the EU. And that only 28% thought it was a good thing, right? And this is asking English people, on a referendum, 50% of English people at the moment say they would leave, and 33% that they would stay. You compare this with the figures for Scotland, where it's actually the opposite. 53% say they would stay, and 34% say they would leave. Right? So almost perfect inversion there. And so what it's going to be interesting to see, and again, if you want another event to hang some teaching on, the referendum on Scottish independence in 2014 will be really interesting. And what's coming into the fore now is the European dimension to this. Scottish nationalists are now saying, well, if you vote to stay in the United Kingdom, you may end up leaving the EU anyway because the English are going to vote you out, and is that something that you really want? So that kind of dynamic, I think, is really worth keeping a weather eye on, and for me that explains a lot about the emergence of English nationalism in the last 10 or 20 years or so. Thank you.
Thank you.